weren't including people with diabetes in the actual declaration and experience. And we've come a long way since then, and we're excited to tell you a little bit about that. But there's still so much, work that needs to be done. And ultimately, this was a really defining moment for me because, I realized that we all need to make sure that our voices are heard, that our voices are in action to ultimately change this.
Next
Next
slide,
slide,
please.
please.
So, the United Nations General Assembly, or UNGA, what is that? Well, it takes place every September in New York, and it's when world leaders set the global agenda on health, climate, peace, and equity. Every few years, there's a high level meeting focused on NCDs, and this year's, the fourth, also addressed mental health conditions. Those meetings produce political declarations, global promises that guide budgets, funding, and national priorities. And that means one simple truth: what's included gets funded, what's omitted gets ignored. Next slide, please.
So we thought that we would give you just a little bit of a history lesson here so you can kind of understand, how we got to where we are today. First and foremost, back in 2006, a civil society organization, pretty much International Diabetes Federation, led the advocacy movement that created a UN diabetes resolution. It was great. It recognized diabetes finally. Unfortunately, it didn't mention type 1 specifically, nor the importance of insulin, but it did actually establish the World Diabetes Day campaign. Unfortunately, world leaders didn't take it seriously enough. So IDF combined forces with sister federations in cancer, respiratory disease, and heart disease to create the NCD Alliance. And they were very successful in creating the first high-level meeting on NCDs back in 2011. Unfortunately, at the time, it only mentioned diabetes and did not specifically mention type 1 diabetes or life-saving insulin. And as Margaret Chan says, what gets measured gets done. And unfortunately, a lot was kind of omitted. Then in 2018, there was a second high-level meeting and new targets were established. But again, type 1 and life-saving insulin were omitted. Then breakthrough happened in 2021. There was a new UN resolution that explicitly named type 1 diabetes as a life-saving drug. Then in 2022, as a result of that, the Global Diabetes Compact was created that did include type 1 and specifically mentioned type 2 as well as insulin access. And then here we are today in 2025, where unfortunately type 1 diabetes was removed again, generically talking about diabetes, and insulin was also removed from that final declaration. Um,
Next
so with
slide.
all that progress, unfortunately, we lost a lot of ground, and ultimately that's why our voices today matter more than ever.
Yes, unfortunately, we are living in very polarized and challenging times. However, there were important wins. World leaders reaffirmed their commitment to tackling NCDs and prioritizing mental health. They recognized that access to essential medicines is a matter of global health equity, a core message of our community. They also elevated early diagnosis and youth health. And even though lived experience was recognized, that's already a win. But it was not enough. It's insufficient because recognition alone does not help if it is not accompanied by budget and by mechanisms and frameworks for this lived experience engagement, and not just engagement, but meaningful engagement and co-creation right from the very beginning. Besides that, people with NCTs were sharing their stories and participating in many side events and were shaping conversations successfully, which is also a win. Next slide, please.
Yeah, and real quickly, I wanted to celebrate that last fact. The first UN high-level meeting, lived experience wasn't represented at all. It was just civil society. So we've made, credible changes since then. And I see so many people in this chat that actually were instrumental in sharing their lived experiences to shape policy. And thank you all for taking your voices and elevating them, wherever you are in your community or at the global level. Um, and while Lucy was able to speak about some of the positives, I think it's also very important to kind of recognize where we fell short. First and foremost, civil society language was cut down to one line. That's the piece that represents us, right? Like we are civil society, it's our voices, and unfortunately, it was really shortened to just that one line. Type 1 diabetes and insulin, missing again, unfortunately. The whole kind of aid world, or at least a lot of the aid world, has fell apart, in recent years. There was a lot of talk, a lot of rhetoric around creative financing mechanisms, but unfortunately, no creative or no financing mechanisms were really kind of included. And as a result of that, it's almost impossible to hold governments accountable, for shaping change. And then, last but not least, we're still in this very top-down driven process that's not community driven at all. And the reality is when people with diabetes or lived experience, are shaping the agenda, uh, UN high level leaders are really just professional meeting attendees, sitting in policy theater and instead of actually working on human progress. And that's the reality of where we are today.
Next slide, please. So this is where each of us comes in. Declarations are written in New York, but implementations happens everywhere else. We can transform those global promises into community action by advancing early detection, ensuring affordable insulin, and pushing for equitable care in our local systems. The big decisions happen in New York, and sometimes that sounds very foreign to the person living with diabetes or to the local advocate. But we can push and change things from our communities and from the place that we are. And each of us has a role to play to make this happen.
Exactly, Lucy. You know, each of us lives in, our own community, in our own country. We know, what barriers, exist, where we live, right? And we also bring that lived experience. And that lived experience gives everything credibility. It also, gives everything, a responsibility. And so we can break down those barriers and hold leaders accountable as long as we raise, our voices. But if our first voices weren't, fully heard, at the United Nations, we can make them heard everywhere else. And I think that's why we're all here today, right? Is we want to make sure that our voices are put into action. So at the end of the day, when people living with chronic diseases and conditions like diabetes, aren't part of the agenda, progress just isn't simply happening. So let's make that happen together and let's explore that a little bit later. I wanted to kind of say one other thing before we close, and you can move to the next slide as well. And that's, we've come again a very, long way since 2011. But we still have a lot further to go, right? Right, Lucia?
Absolutely. There's so much to do, but the first step is already taken. And that step is recognizing that people with lived experience hold a unique expertise that no other stakeholder has. So we don't have to be ignored at the table because we are that table. That table is ours, and we are the main stakeholder interested in diabetes because we live with this condition every single day of our lives. So what do we go from here? Well, we have to advance a lot, and we'll get there by ensuring that lived experience isn't just a story told, but it's a starting point for every policy and for every partnership.
Yeah. And so the political declaration shouldn't just mention us at the end of the day. It should sound like us. It should be written by us. And that's the spirit, right, of Voices in Action. And to help kind of tee it up for the next section of this as well, in order for us to, really make sure that every voice is heard, we also have to break down those stigmas and those barriers so that everybody feels comfortable coming to that table that Lucia mentioned. So with that, I'll hand it back over to James to share a little bit about the next section.
Sure. And I think we've been putting a lot of stuff on Pedro. So Pedro's actually helping us out in Brazil. So I think we have a situation where I think Lucia, I think you sent someone the link, so we have like 10 Lucias in chat, but I think you're only one. We only have one Lucia. Um, so yeah, well Pedro's sorting that out, and then also yep, there we go. We'll go through all the nice slides. I think next slide, Pedro. I mean, we made slides, we might as well use them. Um, the segue here is basically I'm kind of disappointed in what happened. I mean, because if we looked at the first draft of this declaration, it had type 1 diabetes, it had the use of insulin, it had more effective language on the incorporation of civil society, and it had the global diabetes targets, which included 100% of people having access to insulin and the ability to self-monitor themselves. And now